Good morning, everyone. I'm going to assume for this that most of you have had a high exposure to alcohol, maybe other drugs. So in this, I'm going to concentrate more on some of the new stuff. Actually, thinking about that, how's that for the first speed dating pickup line? Ben, speed dating contestant number 5. Cool. So there are 4 points that I'm going to make in this one today. The first point is that alcohol and cannabis remain the most common substances used by young people in New Zealand. Forget what you see in the media. There is a problem with methamphetamine in New Zealand. Most of our young people aren't running around fiending for methamphetamine. In fact, there are some other data that backs this up as well. The National Residential Methamphetamine Treatment Program for young people still finds that the alcohol and cannabis are the substances that young people rank as the substances that cause the most concern in their life, even though they were using methamphetamine. And most of that methamphetamine use was on much more of an occasional basis. So most of our teenagers are still the stock standard alcohol, cannabis. It's mostly around from the latest stats that we have, which are still relatively outdated because we haven't had a representative survey in a while. But for most of our indications among teenagers, other drug use, the highest one is 4%. There are new resources that can provide you with youth-relevant information. What we're trying to do is focus this as much as possible around stuff that's relevant for young people. Unfortunately, the war on drugs and how we have been dealing with things has taught us the wrong way to be able to engage with young people about alcohol and other drugs. Because we know that in New Zealand, from some of the focus groups that we've been running, most young people think that addiction and that problems from alcohol and other drugs are not relevant for that age group. And in fact, they see that in that age group, particularly to do with alcohol, that there is so much minor annoyances that happen on a regular basis, things like hangovers, things like turning up late to work because you've been drinking the night before and stuff like that, that happens so much that it's not a risk factor. And so when we've used those old techniques of if you talk about risk, then that will avoid or give people the knowledge, then they shift their behavior from it, then actually most of that is falling on deaf ears because we don't live our lives avoiding the risk. We live our lives aiming to move towards stuff that's important to us in our lives. So here's some of the new stuff that's out there. The Did You Know series is a series of short 1-minute videos that has the key facts around alcohol, cannabis, volatile substances, methamphetamine, and last week we just released one on synthetic psychoactive substances. I'm going to play you the alcohol one just as an example, but what we've tested with these videos as well is that parents have used them to play to their children and then saying, what do you think about that? Do you know much about these drugs? Which gave the opportunity to start a conversation around what they knew and re-story a lot of what their misinformation was. We heard some stories from parents of a 7-year-old who played these videos, and then they found out that their 7-year-old had seen so much talk around methamphetamine that anybody acting weird in the supermarket they thought was high on P. So it gave them the opportunity to say that's not actually true. So here's the alcohol one as an example.
Did you know that one standard alcoholic drink takes at least 1 hour to leave your body? In New Zealand, all alcoholic drinks must be labelled with the standard drinks they contain. The more you drink, the longer it takes to be sober and safe. When you drink, alcohol goes into your stomach where it mixes with any food, and some of the alcohol goes into your bloodstream. The mix then moves to your small intestine. Most of the alcohol heads to the brain from here, affecting your coordination, confidence, and judgment. Food slows down this process, which is why eating before you drink is a great idea. The blood then moves to your liver, which works hard to get rid of the alcohol, breaking it down so it can leave your body in urine. It's also a diuretic, making you thirsty and dehydrated. First, you can get flushed, energetic and talkative. Next, you could get more confident, emotional and uncoordinated. This can lead to risk-taking, memory loss and aggression. Then your body tries to rid itself of the alcohol through vomiting. Finally, you can experience blackouts, wet yourself, and your vital organs start to shut down. Drinking a lot can cause hangovers, emotional stress, make it harder to study, play sports, enjoy life, and lead to physical and mental damage. Also, drinking while pregnant can cause big problems for baby. So remember to eat before you drink, count the standard drinks, and always look out for your mates.
choice. So that's just one of the examples. We've got those 5 videos there. There's 4 of them that are in te reo. We also have them in posters that can be stuck up as well. The posters we've got in Chinese traditional te reo, and we're working on translations into Samoan and Tongan. The other thing is they're all Creative Commons, so feel free to use them, remix them, have them playing in the background and reception, wherever it will be useful. So that's that series. In the SACS ABC manual that we Workforce have been working on, both in that one and the Bridging the Gap resource down the bottom, the one that the page that I'll highlight your attention to is talking about harm minimization, how we've pulled that in as a checklist. So one of the ways you can use it is photocopying it, giving it to young people, saying, here is a list of harm minimization things that have worked for other young people. Which ones will work for you? So while you're giving the brief advice back to young people. The substances overview table that it looks at there, this is it here. We've got key harm minimization tips on one side and the stages of intoxication in there as well that are relevant to young people. You'll have noticed that in the Did You Know video that we've got a slightly different stages of intoxication that was spoken about there than would commonly be in the blood alcohol index. The reason for that is that teenage bodies handle alcohol much differently from adults. They don't have as many of the physical symptoms of intoxication. So if you see a teenager swaying or slurring their words, they're usually in the very later stages of drunkenness, which is why if they've learnt to drink at home and they're basing it on the behavior that they see from their parents, whose bodies are not as resilient in terms of alcohol for the physical symptoms, they may be trying to drink to the same stage of swaying or slurring words or something like that, or where you put the wine glass on the table a little bit more carefully, which after some adults is maybe 2 or 3 drinks, no judgment, and for children will be young people will be much later. So what we've done in the pocket drug information and harm minimization cards that are just being printed at the moment is had those stages of intoxication in a youth relevant way on there. It also highlights that most of the pleasant effects happen earlier, and then the unpleasant effects is in the later stages of intoxication. Point number 3. So this is some new research that we've done in New Zealand that makes it a little bit easier to understand how to engage teenagers and young adults. So what we did was we used a company over in the States that have looked at market segmentation, which is commonly done in the commercial industry, and pulling that into a health context. So they came here, they did the research within Auckland. We also went into Palmerston North to replicate it because we found that was the most typical non-Auckland town in New Zealand, apparently. And what we were doing, we had quite a few discussion groups where we were looking for the groupings which we call peer crowds. So they're groupings that share common values, attitudes, norms, and lifestyles. So it's not necessarily peer groups. They're not friends with each other all the time, but they're groups that kind of give us a way to be able to segment down into 4 or 5 groupings that look like this. And they transcend geographical boundaries too. So we found the same groups in Palmerston North to the ones we found in Auckland, just slightly different sizes. So what we found was that there were 4 teenage peer crowds in New Zealand. I'll explain those briefly. So the first one and the biggest one was kind of mainstreamy, and I heard this described as this is kind of the peer crowd that you want your children to be. They have the greatest protective factors and they have the lowest risk profile as well. It's generally really protective to be in mainstream. There was a small subgroup of that one that we were calling the chill subgroup, and essentially we were seeing that as the Māori or Pacific Island flavour for the mainstream group. So very strong cultural connection, hung out a lot for cultural activities, maybe drank a little bit more than the rest of the mainstream peer crowds, but was still very low risk compared to the other peer crowds. The other ones that we noticed, they were the alternative ones. So they were the, pretty much it didn't matter what they were as long as they weren't seen as mainstream. There was a lot higher mental health risk within that one. And what we found through some of the follow-up research that we're doing this year is that actually that was part of their identity too. So there was we form our friendship groups based on who is struggling in the same way that we are. So you may see some of those accessing your services too. We have hip-hop, which had the highest risk profile, particularly in terms of alcohol. So that was the highest volume drunk, the earliest age of initiation, and the most severe consequences associated with it. The common factor for those ones is that they felt like the system was out to get them and that everything was a challenge to try and overcome. And then the fourth peer crowd was popular, or what we were calling popular. They were the ones that wanted to be seen. They were often the partier ones. They were out there having fun. They faced a lot of social pressure, and the pressure to drink alcohol at those times was really, really strong because that was tied in very strongly with their identity. And they were the second highest risk group for alcohol, mostly in terms of that social pressure and from drinking a lot on one occasion, so binge drinking on the weekend, embarrassing things happening to them. Moving up into young adults, we did it looking at 18 to 25. It's essentially the same peer crowds, but a different life context. So those mainstream ones often had kids by then and an even lower risk profile that we were finding. That chill subgroup was still there, so that very strong Māori or Pacific Island flavour. One of the things that I'd like to highlight there is that to me, I think if we're trying to target Māori or Pacific Island communities, we need to be really careful how we do that. If we front our campaigns with Māori or Pacific Island values and then say, but be careful of the drinking within this population, essentially that's the group that we're reaching with these messages because they're the ones that identify really strongly with it, and we're adding stigma onto that group because they're very low risk anyway, and also pushing away the Māori or Pacific Island people that are in those other groupings that are more at risk. So something to keep in mind. Our hip-hop ones have grown older. There is a subgroup in that one of gangs and stuff, some of them posturing into gangs or being involved in gangs. Again, highest risk for alcohol consumption and other factors, still believing that the system is out to get them. The popular ones have branched into a couple of different areas. So there's partier and professional. So they often were found in the same places associating for happy hour. The thing for the professional ones is that they had career that was very important to them. So they might go out drinking the same places, but they'd stop after happy hour finished and they wouldn't be seen getting wasted in public. The partier ones placed less emphasis on their career, and so we're out there longer and we're still the second highest risk in terms of alcohol consumption. And our alternative crowd, the easiest way to describe the young adult version is kind of hipster. So I'm going to assume that we know what hipster is so that we can move quickly on into the last point that I'll make is asking what's important to you and what's getting in the way of that lets you tailor the brief advice. So that point number 3 of that new information, that's one of the ways that we can use it to be able to look at this here. That point there, people don't need to agree with us to change. And I think that's where we were going wrong with our techniques of talking a lot about the risks associated with substance use, because we're trying to get them to buy into the idea that alcohol or other drugs may be harmful or may be risky things. They don't actually need to agree with that, but they need to agree with what we're suggesting will help them to grow the things important to them. And as a final example for that partier crowd and stuff like that, what's important to them was being seen, being out there in public, and the social pressure that they face was strong because of that. So focusing our brief advice around, okay, how can we limit the amount of alcohol so that you're not having that embarrassing photo taken of you or when you're wasted everywhere? Don't say wasted everywhere, that's not the good way to go. But something along those lines is seen more relevant, and they don't need to agree with us that alcohol is bad, but they'll change their behaviour more likely because of that. And then for the hip-hop ones, that's more about how can we support you to live a better life with all these pressures that are facing you and engage with your community around you that isn't adding another challenge of alcohol and other drugs in the mix. And that's the brief advice that's more tailored to them. Cool. Those are the 4 points. Thank you.